FIDE Candidates 2022 Round 4 recap and odds update both before and after the round. So let's start with the odds going into this round. We see Caruana was a huge favorite with a +1 score. Nepomniachtchi second, also with a +1 score. So let's see how these games went today. Starting out with the first game that finished, we had Nepomniachtchi with the white pieces against Alireza with the black pieces. And we see a Sicilian Nidor. So a little bit more aggressive of an opening from Firouzja. Let's see what Nepomniachtchi comes up with. All this is pretty standard so far. We've seen f3 and e5 before in this tournament. The idea typically is white would like to queenside castle, put the king over here, and then start pawn storming black. Black wants their king on g8 and start pawn storming white. So these tend to be very dynamic positions with a lot of chances for both players to win, decreasing the draw chances. So all of this, again, pretty standard. And a big component from this game is to watch the clocks. We have an hour and 58 versus an hour and 56. So both players still very comfortable in their theory. See both sides start to push the pawns, trying to attack the opponent's king. All of this pretty standard still. Now king to b1. This is kind of the first big thing from Nepomniachtchi. So he spent 10 minutes on this move. And if you look at the Stockfish eval, it's saying white's up about half a pawn. If you compare these two pawns to these two pawns, white has 2 pawns on the 5th rank. Black is about to have 2 pawns on the 5th rank with a tempo on the knight. So it looks like black is just very slightly faster in terms of getting the pawns rolling. Great move by Alireza. He plays pawn to a4, kicking the knight. And the only good move, according to the computer, is knight b to c1. And this position looks super passive for white, but you can definitely see there is still some potential over here on the king side. I think f6 is the move that white really wants to play. If Nepomniachtchi playing the white pieces can play f6, that opens up this g7 pawn, which gives direct access to the king down the g file. So if you're playing black here, you're in Alireza's shoes, you got to be a little bit afraid of pawn to f6. He plays pawn to d5, kind of opening up the center. And at first this looks like a strange move. Why did you just give up a pawn? What if white goes e takes d5? Well, then there's knight to d6. You took this knight off the back rank, put it on a very nice square, blockading the d pawn. And this knight also kind of supports the attack over here on the queen side and some of these important center squares. So it's a pawn sacrifice by Firouzja, but a very nice one. After d5, though, Jan goes for the critical move, pawn to f6. This is the critical try in the position. This is how to try to open up Firouzja's king side. G takes f6 played, G takes f6, and now knight takes f6. So here, if you look at the material count, Alireza is +1. If you look at the clocks, Alireza is plus 10 minutes, hour and 46 to an hour and 36. So see, it feels like everything is kind of going Alireza's way so far. Eval is 0.00. He's up on the clock and he's up 1 pawn. Knight to g3. Now we start to see some of this compensation for the pawn. Knight can head into f5. Bishop can head into f6. And we know the g file is still wide open, ready to attack the black king. We see a trade on f1. Now pawn to a3 by Alireza, trying to open up these dark squares around Jan's king. Plays b3 though. And at this point, the last couple moves, let's actually go back and look at the clock. So 146, he spent a half hour, Alireza did, to trade the bishops. And this is a critical moment because at this point, the eval is 0.00. The best move is king to h8. Other good moves are knight to d6, queen to c7. This bishop trade, though, gives a 0.7 edge to Nepomniachtchi. This starts to give white an advantage on the board, and he gave an advantage on the clock. So now we see 20-minute advantage for Jan on the clock. On this move, Alireza had an hour and 15 minutes. He plays a3 down to 47 minutes. That's another half hour off the clock. Keep in mind, these players are only on move 21. They have to get to move 40 with no increment. So he needs to make essentially another 19 moves in 47 minutes. It's not critical time pressure yet, but in a position like this with a lot of tactics on the board, especially, you really don't want to let that clock burn down too low. And Jan is a very quick player who's got a good intuition, sharp on the tactics. So you got to be a little bit careful against Jan in particular. D3 is played, King H8, a 10-minute think. So now we're kind of getting into that territory where it's like, okay, under 2 minutes a move for Firouzja to complete the next 18 moves in 37 minutes. So about 2 minutes a move. He takes D5 played. So Jan wins back the pawn. We're material equal. And if you compare the two kings, it looks like the black king is just a little bit more exposed. There's no G pawn at all. The white king does have some holes on these dark squares, but he's also protected by these three pawns. So there's no pawns missing for the white king, but the black king is missing the G7 pawn. Knight to D6. Now, this is just crazy. This is a blunder, but it's very difficult to figure out why. The pawn on B4 hangs, but it feels like this would be a way to open up the white king. Like maybe the rook can come to B8. This knight is coming into C4, utilizing this pin on the B file. Uh, it looks extremely dangerous to take on B4. You know, if I saw this in a game, I would spend a lot of time before deciding to take B4, and I would more likely go with a safer route and try to attack the black king, like maybe queen to G2, trying to line up on the G file. It's very hard to shift gears and go from kingside attack to, oh, hey, let me grab this pawn on the queen side, open up my king a little bit, and maybe help your own attack. So knight to D6, blunder by Firouzja, and it only took Jan 3 minutes to find the correct move. Queen takes B4. And oftentimes blunders come in pairs. You know, if you have a bad position, you just made a mistake, it's very common to make another mistake immediately after. Knight to D7 is the strongest move here according to the engine, followed by F5. Trying to kind of put those pawns up in the center and use them as a bit of a shield to prevent the white pieces from attacking your king. So knight D7, F5, that's the best plan in the position. Firouzja instead plays rook to C8. And now we see that eval bar go up to plus 7.0. This is a mistake by Firouzja. Bishop to B6 is played, and it looks like that A3 pawn may even die at some point. The rook just left the A file, went over to C8, and according to the engine, Firouzja is already lost, and he's down to 25 minutes. Jan's 1 hour and 16 minutes. Queen D7, and now we see a very nice move. Queen comes back to E1. This threatens to win the E5 pawn, which currently has no defense. And how does black defend this pawn? It's very uncomfortable. You play a move like pawn to E4. Now the bishop comes to D4, getting on this really juicy diagonal, pointing at the black king. So Firouzja goes rook to B8. And now we see bishop to A5, trying to come back to this diagonal, pointing at the king. And you can really feel now the pressure that black is under. How can black get counterplay against the white king? Knight to C4. This is the idea we talked about earlier, utilizing the pin. Bring that knight close by. You know, maybe there's some tactics here. But look at this move by Jan. Very cool under pressure. It only took him 2 minutes. Pawn to D6. Attacking the bishop. It's a temporary pawn sacrifice. If bishop takes D6, rook takes F6. So the bishop is tied down to the knight. The queen can't take because of this rook. And if knight takes, this knight is now pinned to the queen, and it allows white to play queen takes E5. So really, white is getting everything that he wants in this position. Jan is in the driver's seat, playing confidently, and he's spotting all the best moves. Bishop to D8 was played, a retreat by Firouzja, and you can just tell black is in kind of desperation mode. Bishop back to C3, pinning the pawn, attacking the F6 knight and the king on H8, and then through this X-ray of the E pawn. Queen to E6, bringing another defender in. But now we see knight to D3. There's 3 pieces attacking this pawn and 2 defenders. Knight to D5 by Firouzja, going for some counterplay. You know, sometimes if you bring in enough attackers around your opponent's king, tactics can present themselves, or there's more chances for your opponent to make a mistake. Jan has an hour left on the clock, 63 minutes to be exact, for 10 moves. He has 6 minutes per move. I don't think he's likely to make a mistake, but Firouzja's doing the best he can to encourage Jan to make a mistake here. Knight to f4. Look at this move. Hitting the queen, hitting the knight, utilizing the pin. This is forcing the trade of knights, and it's eliminating some of the counterplay that Firouzja has in the position. So knight takes, rook takes, and now Firouzja has to play this passive move, pawn to f6. Otherwise, rook takes c4 and bishop takes e5 type tactics are in the air. Yeah, this is not good for Firouzja. +7 position still according to the engine. Now we see a cool move by Jan, queen to e2, simply threatening to win the knight and asking black, where do you put it? Firouzja decides to tuck the knight onto b2, and Jan just ignores it and says, okay, this knight on b2 doesn't actually attack anything in my position. Show me what you're doing, Alireza. Why is the knight on b2? How are you going to use the queen and rook to attack? Your d8 bishop, f8 rook are both sitting passively. I'm going to bring the heat and start to attack these pawns, which end up shielding your king. Rook to e8 played, and now rook to h4. Watch out, tactics coming up. The rook might even sacrifice here. Pawn to f5, and look at this move by Nepomniachtchi. Oh, I should also note, Alireza has burned his clock down. He has 34 seconds, which is insane, to make 6 moves. So he spends 17 seconds to push this pawn, and rook takes h7 check. Brilliant move by Nepomniachtchi, just putting black away. King takes h7, and now we get to see the finish. Queen to h5 check. If the queen blocks, the rook on e8 gets captured. That was the strongest move for black, but we're still looking at +12 territory according to the engine. And when it goes deeper, it'll even say like +20, and it'll probably find a checkmate eventually. King to g8 was played though, trying to kind of hold the material temporarily. But now there's knight takes f5, and the rook is coming to g1 next. This is a forced checkmate in 6 moves according to the computer. Bishop to f6 played, rook to g1 check, and here Alireza resigns. Just to show what could happen, king to f8 is the best defense. Queen to h6 check. There's no escape for the black king here. And if king f7, there's this beautiful tactic, rook to g7 check. If bishop takes, queen takes his mate. And if king goes down, we have check followed by mate. And Nepomniachtchi gets the win. He's +2 in the tournament. The last cycle's winner is now in clear first unless Caruana can win his game. Let's go to the next one. We have Richard Rapport against Hikaru Nakamura. And in this game, we see a Berlin. And it's kind of one of these like closed Berlin lines. We didn't get the queen trade. And again, we see this idea by Nakamura going for h6 and g5. He seems to like that this tournament. In this game, honestly didn't have a lot of excitement. If you look at what happens, all of these pieces start trading off, including the queens. So now we're in a rook and knight endgame with some pawns, and the rooks start trading off. And really, I think the players were content with the draw on this one. It's a long tournament. They didn't feel they got anything out of the opening. And Nakamura is really just blitzing his moves. He has an hour on the clock still. Rooks come off the board. Now we get this knight and pawn endgame. Pawns are completely symmetric. And knight and pawn endgames are very similar to king and pawn endgames. Symmetric pawns. There's not going to be any winning chances here. 0.00 eval. So the players just all swap down. Knight versus knight. Draw agreed. So both of these guys are on an equal score so far. Hikaru with the black pieces, I think, is okay to draw a lower rated player in Rapport with the white pieces. Even though we see 2760, 2764, I think Hikaru probably feels he's a favorite against Rapport because Hikaru can definitely play at that 2800 level. So with the black pieces, I'm sure he was okay with that draw. Now we have Jan-Krzysztof Duda against Timur Radjabov. These are the 2 lowest rated players in the tournament. I think it's a game where they can definitely try to notch a win and get on to the leaderboard. We see this kind of Roy Lopez Berlin defense set up again. But here we get this no trade situation where all the pieces are on the board. And I think the largest advantage for Duda was right about here after bishop to b4 check, c3 bishop a5. The engine is saying around 0.6 or zero point 0.7. The largest advantage Duda had in the game, but it really didn't materialize into much. We see this trade on f6, so now we have an imbalanced 2 knights for bishop and knight. A little bit of counterplay for Radjabov down the g file. But now knight takes b6, and all of a sudden we lose that imbalance of the bishop versus knight. And the only imbalance now is the fact that Radjabov has 2 sets of double pawns. So can Duda make anything of this? It looks like the engine says 0.6, maybe c4, maybe a4, h3 is a move as well. He plays queen to f3, but f5 is a very nice move by Radjabov, trading off one of the double pawns, sacrificing it temporarily, but knowing that he's going to lift his rook up and triple attack this pawn. That was just a nice way to equalize. And at this point, the only move that gives any advantage according to the engine is queen to e4. And it still looks to me like a dead draw. He plays a4. And at this point, everything just starts trading off. Queens come off the board, 2 rooks each and a bunch of pawns. And it's similar to the Nakamura game. The players kind of know at this point, trade, trade, trade. Neither side has an advantage. And a draw was agreed right after move 40. All right, final game, Ding against Fabiano Caruana. Can Fabiano get a win to stay tied with Nepomniachtchi? Because remember, Nepomniachtchi was the first game done of the day. This is the last game done of the day. So Fabiano can see that Jan was winning. He sees that Jan won the game. Is he able to get a win against Ding who's having a tough tournament so far? We see this Queen's Gambit that turns into a Rogozin. So Rogozin is when you have this structure for black, and then bishop to b4 comes next against this structure for white. Ding gets a little bit of an edge after the opening. I was watching the broadcast with Anish Giri and Gotham Chess, Levi Rosman. And at this point, Anish said he's looked at this line. It's a little bit of a novelty by black sticking the knight out on a5. And he said it's pretty drawish though. Like if white wants to draw, he can play for that. If white wants to play for a slight edge, he can do that. And it looks like Ding plays very solid here. There is the possibility to play right here. A takes b4, and this gets you a different type of position, because if knight takes f3, g takes, we get this attacking potential for white, but also the double pawns for white. Ding did not go for that, and he just plays knight takes d2 back, goes for the solid route. So from Fabiano's point of view, when your opponent's playing white in a position that's solid, and they just want to kind of hold that draw in hand and play for a very, very slight advantage, it's very hard from Fabiano's point of view to play for a win here. So a trade occurs on c3, and the biggest advantage for white in the game is coming up right here. Rook to c8 played by Fabiano, and the engine says 0.48 for Ding after takes, queen takes b6. So this is the largest advantage of the game, half a pawn. Ding wins 1 pawn, but I think Fabiano knew in the back of his mind that this is going to be a draw. He has just enough to be able to hold everything. Oftentimes 1 pawn up is not enough to win if there's nothing else going on in the position, especially if it's going to trade into a rook and pawn endgame. And that's what ends up happening. So the queens come off, the knights come off, we get a rook and pawn endgame with only 1 pawn advantage. And this just doesn't lead to anything. We get this 4 versus 4 with 1 extra pawn. And this is worth spending some time studying, but essentially the black king is close enough to the pawn that the pawn is going to get captured. And if white tries to go behind and go after these pawns, which Ding did, it's pretty easy for black to give up one of those pawns to win the c pawn. And now you get this textbook 4 versus 3 on one side. Almost always a draw. There have been some cases, though, where a grandmaster has lost this with the 3 pawns. But I think at a high level like this, once they hit move 40, which happens right here, now we get the 4 versus 3 with the bonus time on the clock, and really not much is going to happen. Pawns trade off. Ding doing his best to try to create some winning chances, But the Philidor position is when it's king, pawn, and rook against rook and king. That's a really easy draw for super GMs. Even for masters, it's a pretty easy draw. So Fabi's trying to avoid that situation, or Dinglarin's trying to avoid that situation. Fabi's trying to create it. Ding does not want to trade off one set of pawns. He plays here f5. If e takes f, king takes f, that is a draw. But Fabiano just inserts some checks first and proves, hey, I don't have to immediately take. And now we see this repetition. Draw agreed. So how does this affect the odds? Nepomniachtchi gets the only win. Let's check it out. I'm tucking my king in the center of the chart now. So Fabiano at 2.5 points is actually still the favorite in the odds. The reason for this is because he has an extremely high peak rating and he has a high rating. And based on the colors and the opponents that he has left, he's still slightly higher than Jan Nepomniachtchi. Jan is very close though, and if the players keep drawing, Jan will creep ahead of Caruana because Caruana is going to have less chances to catch back up. Nakamura is still sitting here comfortably, third place, about the same odds as he had to start the tournament, right around 14%. Firouzja with that loss comes way down here to join Ding. So Firouzja and Ding are both on -1 scores, as well as Radjabov, who's down here at 2%. Rapport is sitting around 4%, and Duda is also 2%. So these guys are kind of bottom of the pack. They definitely need to get a win to get back into the event. Nakamura is sitting pretty comfortable, but he could use a win as well. Jan can coast here. Caruana's got to constantly look for a win to be able to tie Nepomniachtchi, and that will keep him kind of in the favorite spot going forward. Hope you guys enjoyed this recap. We will see you tomorrow for another recap. Thanks for watching.